Okay, welcome to part 2 of our contracts webinar series. We are going to be discussing bidding for contracts today and subcontracts. For bidding, we're going to talk about different forms and documents that get used in the process, the bid process itself, types of bids. For subcontracts, we're going to talk about subcontracts with subcontractors. We're going to talk about subcontracts with suppliers, different responsibilities of the different parties involved, and we're also going to talk about different ways that the contracts can be arranged. Before we get going, I'm going to remind you to edit your name and email so we can get you your continuing education unit certificate. So to start us out, let's talk about bidding for contracts. The bidding docs for bids will lead to an offer being accepted and a contract signed. It'll lead to an offer that gets rejected, or it could lead to an offer that gets accepted, but there is no contract that ends up being signed. There are two types of bidding requests. You could get a notice out to contracts, and that informs you of who, what, where, when, what qualifications are needed to be able to bid. It's going to include a public notice about the project coming up and what details will be involved in the competitive part of the bid. Another type of bid request that might come out is an invitation for bid, also known as an IFB. This will have who, what, where, when needs to be involved for the bid to be turned into, what sort of qualifications you need to be pre-qualified to bid for a project, and whether or not it'll be a negotiated bid or a competitive bid among a select group. The documents often include the instructions to bidders, also known as the ITB. Usually you'll see a standard use form of the A701 for this, but it can also be customized for various organizations. Instructions to bidders give the bidders information on how to turn in their bid documents and what those bid documents will look like. It gives them a rules and regulations for bidding on this new project. The availability of the bid docs to sub-bidders may be an issue. The owner of the GC is typically responsible for providing these documentation. The availability of the plans. The more available those plans are, the more realistic your pricing will be, and it'll lead to an overall better bid. It'll have plan rooms or FTP sites. Hard copies of bid documents are usually sent by the UPS or FedEx or the United States Postal Service, and often has a bid doc index key for reference. When it comes to the bid forms that get sent out for the bidding process, they usually send blank copies with the instructions to the bidders of what information needs to be compiled in what areas of the bid. Those bid forms come back fully completed by the bidders to be reviewed by the owner's team. These bid forms may or may not become part of the contract depending on how much the general conditions spell out. Often it should become part of the contract. It lines out the earliest negotiations that describe what the scope of work is and how it's going to be performed. These bid forms need to include the base bid scope of work and pricing, along with any alternates that will be considered for the project. And there also needs to be an agreement for the change order criteria. A bid is often the same as a proposal. It needs to clearly stipulate what each side of the agreement means. Terms can be ambiguous. This is an industry where standard terminology varies from job site to job site, and often there can be confusion with the way things are labeled. Key terms and abbreviations need to be defined and spelled out. It needs to be as simple as possible to be interpreted by a third party. The more ambiguous the proposal is, the more ambiguous the bid documents are, the more likely you will run into change orders as the project unfolds. When asking for a bid, the bidders need to assume that they have a fair chance. Everyone who comes to the table to bid for a project needs to have a mental capacity that they have as much a chance as anyone else to win and perform the work. Intention is everything. Fair and even intention across the board needs to be applied by the owner to ensure a fair bidding process. Clarity is key. As we said earlier, the more ambiguous the documentation is going to be, the harder it'll be to define what is expected in the contract. Terms need to be spelled out in a standardized system. All parties need to be on the same page for what that system is. Time frames for the contract and the overall project need to be well defined, as well as the target for the cost. Bidding is a predecessor to an agreement. It's the first foot in the door that the bidding parties have to analyze the scope of work that is being looked at. They need to observe the key dates in the overall schedule and need to know how liquidated damages could be particularly applied to the project. And they need to have eyes on all the contract documents. They need to have the index drawings. They need to have specs, RFI, any addenda that come out. They need a full picture of what the project is talking about. In part one of our contract series, we talked about the different types of contract sums that we could come across. We talked about that we could have a stipulated sum that is explicit in the bid and an exact end goal for the contract value. Some contracts are unit price contracts, meaning that there is no defined contract sum, only pricing for the different parts and pieces. A cost plus fee contract is implicit in price. There's not necessarily a contract sum that is arrived to when the bid is procured, but there is an understanding of about where that end price would be. And a max cost plus fee, it is explicit of not to exceed value. The ultimate goal of the bid is to reach a signed agreement. This is what completes the contract. It marks the start of when an offer is accepted. Once this bid is signed, it indicates that the terms are met for both parties. It indicates a mutual understanding between those parties, and it locks in big items in the project: your scope of work, your overall price, general qualifications and requirements, just the overall playbook that you guys will be using. Letter of intent is often issued during the bid process. It's a means to initiate action without all the terms being agreed upon. It can be dangerous to both parties because this letter of intent is ultimately signing on one party or the other to obligations that haven't been fully worked out yet. The only work that gets started on is work that is specifically mentioned in the letter of intent. The intent is essentially a promise ring. We haven't agreed to the contract yet, but we intend to agree on the contract. General conditions are pretty typical from project to project, but you shouldn't assume what they are. You should have a keener eye on it. Any changes to the standard forms for the general conditions should be incorporated by reference. There needs to be some sort of marker that calls attention to that item, and so it prevents the misunderstanding. The owner should be the one to approve or alter any general conditions, not the architect or the engineer. It's an administrative piece of paperwork in the bid documents in its nature. Sometimes you will see supplementary general conditions. These are general conditions that are particular to a specific project and are often created from scratch for those particular projects. The AIA A201/1997 is a typical general conditions form. It's intended to be used as one of the contract documents that are formed in the bidding documents. Here's an example of a section that may come out of a general conditions. This is talking about permits, fees, and notices. So this gives you a general overlook of how permits, fees, and notices will be applied to this specific project. Another bid document is the specifications. Construction industry prefers the drawings over the specs, although the specs often take precedence. They often include more particular information on the different scopes of work. The intent of the specifications is to complement the drawings. They're supposed to work hand in hand. If you see a reference to a piece of equipment or a piece of material in the drawings, you can refer to its area in the specifications on how to install it, what the quality control for that piece of equipment or material is. You can check back for consistency with the drawings. And usually the specs are kept in a master format form, divvying up the different scopes of work to different sections in the specifications. There are rules for spec writers, rules of thumb. To be fair, be realistic, to be current, to be consistent, to be brief, clear, and precise. These rules of thumbs are to keep everything as above board as possible, to be about the facts so the people interpreting the specs don't have any ambiguous pieces of information to decide upon. The project drawings show the location of works as well as dimensions and how many of one thing must be performed. The same rules of thumb that apply to the specs apply to the drawings. So be fair and realistic and to be current and precise with the information. Again, it's about ease of interpretation. The more realistic and the easier it is to interpret the information, the less likely there will be changes. Drawings are one of the key bid documents that exist. It is very common for people to get their heads wrapped around a project by looking into the drawings. The better those drawings are in the early stages of the bidding process, the more likely you're going to arrive to a close price. The drawings need to have any addenda incorporated changes into them. Throughout the bid process, it's often that projects will find scopes of work being tweaked or changed altogether before the bids are submitted. The project drawings need to be updated in accordance to those changes. There usually isn't a prioritization between drawings. If there's a discrepancy between the mechanical and the structural, or the architectural and the civil, there's not one plan that outweighs another one. That will require you to submit an RFI to more clearly see where that discrepancy falls. Here's some more information about addendas. They're a change to the bid documents. It can either be an addition to the bid documents, it can be a part of the bid documents are removed or changed. If there is an addenda, if there is a change to the bid documents, then everyone must get those changes. All parties that are bidding the project or looking more into the project need to be aware of those changes. It's up to the design team to keep a record of how these addenda get transmitted, how that information gets disseminated. Addenda are usually used when only absolutely necessary. And because of changes to the project, it's realistic that addenda can cause the bid to increase, become more costly. Addenda can lead to change orders, which would also change the bid docs. And at the bottom, we see a few different things to note with the different types of changes that you could receive in a project. A change order is a change to the bid docs. It can happen during the bid phase or during the execution of the project. An addenda is a change that only occurs during the bid phase. And a modification is a change that only occurs after the contract is signed, during the execution of the contract. When it comes to signing the contract, it is important to sign every page of the contract to show that all information has been received and reviewed. Any change made to the bid documents in the contract need to be read and acknowledged and understood. There needs to be an understanding of the general intent of the contract. Ignorance is no excuse. If at any point you find yourself in a contract that you should not have signed, that was outside of your capabilities or was not understood, ignorance is no defense that will help you after that signature. The bid opening. When it's time to award a project, the bid can be opened in different ways. In a negotiated bid, there are only two parties involved. In a competitive bid, there are three or more parties involved. And in a competitive bid, it starts with the issuance of the bid docs. Everyone gets all the information at the same time, and it ends with the bid submission. Everybody must submit their bids also at the same time. A competitive bid can show itself in various types of contracts, be it a lump sum contract or a cost plus fee contract or any of the other ones that we've found ourselves talking about. The intention of a competitive bid is to award the job to the lowest possible bid. It's a faction of price saving. Usually in competitive bids, the owner is looking for the cheapest possible route. Exceptions to this can be if there is some sort of inflation during the bid process and the lowest bid is so low that it won't be able to cover what the scope of work is. Sometimes there's an insufficient design that could keep the lowest possible bid from being realistic. Oftentimes, competitive bids can result in people intentionally manipulating their data to have a false number that is lower than they originally thought, just in the means of winning work. In lump sum contracts that are competitive, it's fairly straightforward. There are hard bid docs with a mostly complete design. The contract time is specified of when it must start and when it must end, and the alternates, if included, give options more than anything. those alternates need to be clear and concise. They need to be ranked by order of importance. And ultimately, the alternates can be something that sway who gets the award of the job. Competitive bidding for a unit price contract. It's the unit price that is the key factor in the award. It isn't the overall total of the contract. It's only the parts and pieces. Often the bids are given in a lump sum amount because of value engineering options. If a certain bidder is able to come up with cost savings that will lower their unit price value, they can also often be awarded the job because of those value engineering options. Oftentimes, the unit price contract is used in civil work where it's a well-defined scope, but the amount that will be performed is unknown, be it road construction or water utilities, scopes that are repetitive in nature. Competitive bidding for a cost plus fee contract, it's the fee that is often the key factor in the job. Similar to a unit price project, the cost of the project is usually similar across the board, and it's the fee that is what separates one bidder from the next. Oftentimes, the fee that bidders present can be negotiated upon. A max cost plus fee contract, it's similar to the cost plus fee. The fee is the key factor in the award. The final cost projection is also a factor. Being a maximum set contract, if the final cost projection is higher than what is allowed by the maximum, it can lead to losing that proposal. There are different ways to prepare for a contract bid. Could be a planned preparation, which goes through the proper channels of solicitation. It involves a detailed estimate of the scopes of work and the quantity of materials involved. Scopes are able to be reviewed by different members on the bidding party's team. And there's also a high-level executive review that is targeted at the project as well. There are some bids that are too timely to be well planned going into. In an unplanned bid preparation, you are generally throwing numbers at the project to cover the anticipated cost. You see unplanned bid preparation used in projects that are similar in scope to projects that are well known by the bidding party. They can use parametric estimates to compare similar projects and apply potential pricing to, although they haven't been able to conduct a detailed estimate. The bid selection can be either closed or open. In a closed bid selection, the bids are evaluated in private. And there's no concise data to go along with it, be it a design build and or a best value job. This means that the owner is able to gather all of the information provided to them by the bidders and to review that in private without the eyes of the public on them. In an open bid selection, those bids are open to the public. This is usually used in a hard bid scenario with clear, concise data that's already known and a well thought out design. In an open bid, There can be no exceptions. Once the bid is open to the public and the numbers are read aloud, the lowest priced contract will usually win. Bonds are often taken out for bidding. The principal on a bid bond is the bidder or the contractor that is submitting a bid. The surety is whichever bonding corporation they use to secure their bond with. And the obligated party is the owner. Typically, a bid bond insures the bid for about 10% of the bid amount. And this 10% is given based on a credit system with the bonding company. When using a bid bond, the low bid selected and awarded, the bid bond is not exercised. If the low bid does not accept, the surety pays the difference for the next low bid. So in an example, the low bid for a new project is $100,000, which means they would have a $10,000 bond kept at that 10%. The next lowest bidder is $105,000. The low bidder refused to take the contract. Their bid bond, although for $10,000, only pays $5,000 to cover the gap between them and the next lowest bidder. Once the contractor has their bid pulled for refusing the contract, they must pay to get another bid bond. A bidder can withdraw from the bid process prior to the acceptance of their bid. If they feel that they are going to be the low bid and they don't have the resources or the capability to pursue the work, they can remove themselves from the process before the bids are opened and try to avoid their bond being activated. Performance bonds and payment bonds are usually filled out and applied following the bid bond. Abid Depository is a central point for bid collection and selection. This is where all the bidding parties are going to send their information. It's usually a third-party review team that gives the owner or the GC information. This can help eliminate the use of bid shopping. Project bidding became more and more standardized throughout the years. This includes the use of standardized bid forms, something that's processed by a program such as Microsoft Word or something that's written in ink and printed out. The contract sums will be stated in both words and in Arabic figures, and any alternates used will be stipulated concisely, easy to follow. Bids can be withdrawn once they're put into the works. If you accept the withdrawal of a bid, then that means that bid is going to be closing. And the bid can be withdrawn if it's mutually agreed upon by all the parties. Common mistakes that result in a bid withdrawal are an error in decimal places, be it what was supposed to be a $1 million bid ends up being a $100,000 bid. That mistake in decimal place would void the quality of the bid. Quantity differences can also result in bid mistakes that would lead to withdrawing a bid. Or documentation omission. If there is a bid document that is required for the bid and it is forgotten, then that can lead to a withdrawal. When it comes to accepting a bid, to awarding work, it's usually the lowest bid that typically wins. Sometimes it's the best value that becomes the winner of a bid. A firm that shows that with value engineering they can lower their overall price, or they can give a quality of product that would not otherwise be able to be given. When it comes to accepting the bid, the owner often uses their best judgment and can sometimes just select the most qualified candidate. When it comes to rejecting a bid, it's always the owner's right to decide who does or does not get rejected. Intention is the best key to mitigate litigation. If the owner sees that there's been a rejection on a bid, it can be the intention of that bid that they use to decide to go with that decision or not. Rejection should be founded on material defect. If some bid is rejected, it needs to have quantitative reasoning behind it. There needs to be a point in the bid documents that show that that bid was not accurate enough to be accepted. It needs to be there to defend the bidder from a potential vendetta or potential lack of reason to reject it. A promissory estoppel is used to protect the owner and the bidder. A promissory estoppel is a legal note that is legally enforcing a promise. Elements of a promissory estoppel can bind the contractor to bid price if the owner and GC can prove that, one, it received a clean and definite offer from the contractor. Two, that the contractor could expect that the offer would be relied on. Three, the owner or GC did rely on offer and it is reasonable. And four, that the reliance would be a detriment to the owner and the GC. The promissory estoppel ultimately protects everyone involved to say that if someone made a reasonable offer and is capable of fulfilling that offer, then they must follow through. We're to about the halfway point. I just want to remind everyone how to leave their email credentials for the continuing education certificate. So now that we've talked about bidding for contracts, let's talk about subcontracts. A subcontractor is one who does trade work in a contract subsidiary to a primary contract. Ultimately, it is an entity, a party that is performing a scope of work that the main contract signer is responsible for. A supplier is one who supplies materials for construction work and who is not a subcontractor as defined in the primary contract. They're commonly known as a vendor. Supplier is the group or the party, the entity that provides subcontractors and general contractors materials that are needed to perform construction work, but they do not work as far as installing those materials. Why can there be so many problems with subcontracts? Often standard forms are ignored and not used. Sometimes there are inadequate or no forms used by subcontractors and suppliers. Ultimately, it is an issue of poor management by contractors. It is an issue that can be mitigated at the beginning of the forming of the agreement, but it often is pushed onto the back burner. The no forms or the vague forms are used as a means of ease. It's easier to just sign the paperwork and move on with the project, but then those problems can linger. The duties of a contractor is implied in the primary contract. If a subcontractor signs a contract with the contractor, the general conditions and the rules and regulations of the main contract apply from top to bottom. Ultimately, the contractor's main duty is to pay its subcontractors on time. The A201 form is a pretty standard form that gets used for the relationship between contractor and subcontractor. Section 9.6.2 is a section that talks about receiving payment from the owner, that the contractor, once they are paid and once they are made liquid enough by the owner to pay their subcontractors, they must pay their subcontractors. In a supply contract, the duties will be explicitly stated in the supply contract. The supply contract will be able to define what payment on time means. If it's a net 30 contract or if it's a net 45, how much time the general contractor has to pay the supplier will all be defined within the subcontractor agreement. In a primary contract, who provides the field office? Is that the owner or the contractor? It is the contractor. And a subcontract, who provides the field office? The general contractor or the subcontractor? And that's more of a gray area question. It depends largely on the project, the size of scope. Often the general contractor provides some sort of field office that would hold safety materials, first aid kits, things of that nature. And they can give the subcontractor access to that area, but they are not necessarily required to provide the subcontractor their own field administrative area. That would fall onto the subcontractor. The subcontractor's obligation in a subsidiary contract, they have the right to be paid. And in some instances, they have the right to know how much the general contractor was paid on the subcontractor's behalf. They can find out how much the general is being paid in instances of cash flow restrictions. If the subcontractor is having a hard time being paid for their services, they can have the right to know how much the general was paid for those services in an attempt to balance out that cash flow. Another section of that A201 document talks about how the architect will on request will furnish to a subcontractor, if practical, information regarding percentages of completion or amounts applied for by the contractor and action taken. So basically, this is saying that if the subcontractor requests to the architect that they'd like to know how much the general is claiming that their scope of work is finished, what percentage are they billing towards? If the subcontractor is struggling to be paid and they have submitted that they're 50% complete, they have the right to ask the architect how much the general is saying. They may find the general is only claiming 25%. That could be the explanation of why the cash flow is struggling. The obligation of the supplier is ultimately to supply goods. They are paid to make sure materials arrive according to spec and according to time constraints. There is a uniform commercial code that regulates the sale of goods across the states. It provides relief from strict requirements of common contract law to facilitate commerce. Owner and designer obligations in subcontracts are interesting. The owner and designer are never technically parties to the subcontract. The owner technically does not owe anything to the subcontractor directly. In the A201 document, section 9.6.4 states that neither the owner nor the architect shall have an obligation to pay or to see to the payment of money to a subcontractor, except as may otherwise be required by the law. So unless the owner is directly dealing with the subcontractor, all issues of payment are between the general and the sub. The designer can provide a payment certification to the sub. The sub requests access to what percentages billing are being performed, and they can get that information. The designer needs to be accessible to give subcontractors access to the bid documents. And ultimately, it's the designer that is the judge of contract performance. They are going to be the ones that are able to say whether or not the contract has been performed according to the drawings and specs. There's not much to go off of with standard forms when it comes to the owner's relationship with subcontractors. In a worst case scenario, the owner can withhold payment to the contractor if they refuse to pay their subs. This section within the A201 document talks more about the architect and owner's ability to withhold payment in the case that the contractor is not making good on its obligations to its subs and its suppliers. Ultimately, a subcontract is the primary contract documents with the addition of a subcontract agreement. The general conditions for the project are in the primary contract, and so they are not necessarily needed to be repeated in the subcontract. The subcontract, it ultimately contains a list of general subcontractor and general contractor and subcontractor duties. The subcontract will discuss the relationship that the GC will have with them. There will be times where you need to put together a subcontract with a specialty trade. So that would be a company with a contract to do work in a project, usually the work of only one or two trades. On this specialty trade contractor can sometimes have a direct contract with the owner. They would be a contractor for the owner, but not necessarily the primary contractor or the general. Types of contracts that you may see for suppliers may just be an assembly, but it may also be the erection or installation of prefabbed components. You can think of precast concrete. You can think of standard products as far as hardware, as far as fixtures. This often has to do with the different casework that will be included in the finished work of a project. When it comes to different arrangements of a contract, we're talking about who does what in contract terms. When we arrange the contract, it's who's responsible for what actions. And this has to do with the owner, the designer, any design consultants, contractors, subcontractors, supplier, everyone from top to bottom has roles to play. There can be different types of management structures, matrix management versus a stovepipe management. And the different applications of these different styles of management largely depend on the type of project. In a matrix management system, it is more complicated, and there are higher levels of responsibility that get passed between different interacting levels of the hierarchy. Versus stovepipe management is a more straightforward hierarchy. One arrangement of a contract can be a design-build contract. In this arrangement, the contractor becomes the designer, or vice versa. You can see it in commercial work, industrial work, utilitarian work. Often it's in non-aesthetic and quote-unquote standard buildings. Usually a design-build is negotiated, but it's not necessarily mandatory. It could be open to a public bid. A benefit to the owner is that they only have one primary contract to manage. They only have a contract with a single design-build firm. Traditionally, there hasn't been a large mix of the design and the construction world. These design-build firms are starting to break that mold. The most conducive types of construction for design-build are buildings where the cost to obtain desired function is the most important factor to the owner. When it's function over aesthetic is when design-build can come into play. In design-build, competitive bids may be used, although negotiation is often a tactic. Usually for design-build, the owner already has a firm in mind, so there are often times where there are no real other bids in which to compare. So that is where the negotiation often comes into play. Sometimes you will see an arrangement of a contract where the owner is the designer of a project. Some owners have their own design staff, especially if it's a business that's highly specialized. You can think of locks and dams, gates, spillways, highly specialized civil work. And so in this instance of owners acting as designers, do the contractors ever need designers to come to their defense as quasi adjudicators? So basically the question is, if the owner is acting as a designer, in what instance would a contractor need help defending themselves? So there may be an instance where the contractor has to get third-party advice on a project, be it one with the owner acting as the designer having a lot more power. Owners as contractors. Sometimes the owner is self-performing the majority of a construction project. In this instant, a do-it-yourself mentality can lead to cost savings. Can ensure consistently high standards of work and help solve arm's length issues. When the owner is acting as a contractor, it keeps everything in-house. It keeps things from coming up as a surprise. Sometimes it is mostly to save money that the owner will act as a contractor, but oftentimes they can do it for high quality workmanship. If an owner has a history of being a contractor and they have their own system put into place, it can often lead to higher quality results. Sometimes the mentality of not keeping an arm's length between the owner and contractor can result with costs that are not necessarily accurate or believable. With that much skin in the game, so to speak, the owner leads themselves to unreliable record keeping. They may find themselves in a position where their own internal structure is not accurately representing things for their own self-image benefit. There are times where the owner acts as a construction manager, but they're not necessarily performing the work, but they are supervising it with a close eye. Oftentimes you see this in educational work, that the school board will hire a full-time construction manager to handle the standard product of developing schools. Sometimes you will see contractors and designers adopt the hat of an owner. This can be seen often in financial institutions as owners/developers. There can be benefits to having contractors and designers having a portion of investment into a project. There can be benefits of having everyone with this a similar level of commitment to the project, seeking those end goals. But sometimes that can backfire. In the 90s, you had contractors that got involved in the real estate business, thinking that they knew more than their trade, and that led ultimately to a housing bubble. There was a lack of economic information being understood by all the parties involved, and it led to a large loss in money. So these arrangements can be beneficial, but they can also be misused. So that brings us to the end of Contracts Part 2. In Contracts Part 2, we mostly talked about bidding for contracts and subcontracts. When it came to bidding for contracts, we talked about the different forms and bid documents that are put together, what that overall bid process looks like, and especially applied to different types of bids. When it came to subcontracts, we talked about subcontractors, suppliers, the responsibilities of the different parties involved in a project, and different ways contracts could be arranged. If you guys have any questions before we get out of here, I'd love to answer. Okay, well, thank you everyone for attending today. We were glad to have you. I hope that you guys got some good information out of this. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to either myself or anyone else of the ACE team. We will be showing 2 more webinars next week, and I hope that everyone is able to attend.